YouTubers and cinephiles, welcome back to another edition of Nerd With Me, Flicks Talk. So, I'm basically hitchhiking off of the last review I put up of Stephen King's Misery, directed by Rob Reiner, and really got me thinking about like all the Stephen King adaptations, with It and that horrible adaptation of Dark Tower recently. It's like, oh boy. But it really got me thinking of alternate world settings, particularly with, to me, one of the top 3 best adaptations of a Stephen King story is The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick, who did a whole bunch of movies: Clockwork Orange, Spartacus, the original with Kirk Douglas, and Full Metal Jacket. And of course, whenever anybody says Stanley Kubrick, the first thing that comes to mind usually is the movie that changed sci-fi forever, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Even though personally, I'm not really a big fan of 2001: A Space Odyssey from a story standpoint, because it feels like all they were doing was dropping acid and snorting coke or something like that, and just made it up as they went along. But regardless of that, I mean, that movie is the first time that sci-fi was really taken seriously. It paved the way for Star Wars and everything else, Alien, so on and so forth. So I understand its pantheon, its place in the pantheon of classic films and everything like that. Regardless, now what really prompted this video is really the fact that I thought about that, Stephen King, Stanley Kubrick, The Shining, and it's beloved by filmgoers and even people that are big fans of the book and everything like that. I've personally never read The Shining. I've been meaning to get around to it, just haven't done it, whatever. But eventually I will. But obviously it's a little different. But anyway, Stephen King hates The Shining, even though that's one of the few really good adaptations of his work. Because I mean, let's face it, you see a Stephen King movie, usually it's if it's made for TV, or most of them, they're just like, okay, that happened, it was very interesting. You can tell that something's lost in translation, or it's just so weird and makes it seem campy for the most part, or some that really just age terribly. Like the Stan miniseries, which at the time it was like, oh my god, it's Stephen King. It's a four-part miniseries based off of that big massive book, The Stan, which is like his version of Lord of the Rings, except in America, blah 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 blah. And you're like, oh, and I remember watching that and like, oh my god, it's a big event for like a whole month of seeing this thing go to fruition. And I watched it like about a year or two ago, and it's like, oh man, this has aged horribly. You can tell it's made on a TV movie budget. It was just really, really bad. Didn't really get the feel for it. And also I went back and read the book, and it's like, wow, it's a lot darker in the book. Of course, they're making it for NBC, and that's where a lot of the discrepancies with adaptations come to a head, where it's like there's a massive difference in like the tone and mentality. Because you really think about it, most of Stephen King's work has been adapted for national television, like NBC, CBS, ABC, and it's like everything's getting Disney-fied, like a roaming tiger's getting its claws pulled out for the zoo. And I mean, that's basically what it feels like. It's just taking all the bite out of the story and kind of campifying it to the point where it's like, Jesus, feels like it's from Disney Channel or something. But my point is, even though Stephen King hated Stanley Kubrick's rendition of The Shining, like, it had the bite. It may have been a little bit colder in Stephen King's words. He said like it was just really cold, and like mine had warmth and everything like that. But regardless, you look at that movie and that is creepy as hell, and more about symbolism rather than the dissertation of the hotel and everything like that. Various differences. from what I've been told about the book to adaptation. But can you imagine? Like, I always said, like, Stanley Kubrick only had maybe about 12 major movies in his life, and that was like 1980, and then the next one he did was like 7 years later, and that was Full Metal Jacket, and the last movie he did was Eyes Wide Shut. Most expensive porno ever created, by the way, in my humble opinion. But let's say in another Elseworld situation, Stephen King actually liked this adaptation of The Shining, and I think Stanley Kubrick would have made a great career just doing a whole bunch of like adaptations of Stephen King horror movies like throughout the 80s. I think he would have been incredible with his dark sensibility. I mean, really, watch most of his movies. They deal with the dark side of humanity. Doctor Strangelove, Clockwork Orange, The Shining, obviously, Full Metal Jacket. They all deal with the dark, like animalistic type of mentality of humanity. And can you imagine if Stanley Kubrick was the one to bring The Shining, or rather the Stand, to screen, like in like a two-part film, or maybe even a trilogy of films? Man, that would have been incredible. That would have been crazy. Probably would have had a much darker, maybe even bleaker ending, but it would have made sense. Because I'll be honest, predominantly with a lot of Stephen King's stories, like the first 2/3 are incredible. It's usually around the end it kind of like it just falls apart, or you feel like it loses its bite. But I think that's with any type of story. It's very hard to come up with a really great ending. But with Stephen King in particular, it just seems like every time he comes around to the final pages, he kind of lets go off the gas. But that's just my personal gripe about it. But I mean, really think about that though. Stanley Kubrick directing It or The Stand. I mean, and really think about all the stuff that he's done, be it Clockwork Orange or 2001, how those like really worked. And put that with The Stand, how it, like, the bite he would have put into that would have been amazing. It would have been, you would have felt the dread, you would have felt the horror, you would have felt the loneliness of being in this post-apocalyptic land, and it was just be crazy. I mean, hell, imagine if George Romero would have gotten his hands on The Stand. He actually was originally supposed to do The Stand as a 2.5 hour, 3 hour movie, and he even wrote a script for it, and I read it. It's pretty good. I mean, for being cut down to 2.5 hours, that's actually pretty damn good. But I mean, imagine if like Ridley Scott, like right after Gladiator, had gotten a hold of the Dark Tower. I mean, I think that would have been incredible. I mean, what if John Carpenter actually produced his own version of It? I mean, even though Andreas Muschietti did a great job recently with that adaptation, it was awesome. But just imagine John Carpenter, The Thing, getting It. What? Or hell, even John McTiernan or Richard Donner getting some adaptations of the Dark Tower series would have been incredible. I mean, hell, even better for Dark Tower, Joss Whedon. Joss, the Avengers, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Firefly would have been incredible directing this macabre fantasy western epic poem that crosses all of Stephen King's works. It would have been incredible. He would have pieced that together amazingly. I mean, imagine if Michael Mann of Heat and Collateral fame would have directed a version of The Running Man that was more faithful to the book. I mean, that would have been incredible. And actually, that still would be incredible. I mean, imagine. Dreamcatcher, if it was directed by Ridley Scott, would have been incredible, I think. But, the list goes on and on of, like, wow, what ifs? I mean, could have had a whole bunch of like really good adaptations of his stories instead of maybe a handful of them being actually good. Like The Dead Zone was amazing. The adaptation of The Colorado Kid is a television series called Haven. That was pretty good, but there, for each and every one of those, there's about 10 or 12. You're just like, oh god, that was horrible, or that needs to be redone. All in all, I think it would be incredible if half that stuff happened. But of course, we have the great movies like The Shawshank Redemption by Frank Darabont. Actually, Frank Darabont can direct every Stephen King adaptation. That would be cool too, because I mean, the dude has yet to make a bad movie. If some of you all think that The Mist is crap, I'm like, what is wrong with you? But I thought that was amazing, especially the ending. I was just like, oh my god, that's crazy. Regardless, like, I think that's just a thought that came to my mind. Like, man, what if all these adaptations were directed by different people? What if, and it all started with Stanley Kubrick? Like, what if, like, they actually liked each other or liked the adaptation and everything like that? Would it have been different? So anyway, YouTuber Sending Files, man, tell me what you think about this. What do you think? If you know of the film lore I just dropped on you with all these directors and everything like that, if you know about them, comment, like, subscribe. Share me your insights on what you think should happen, what you would have loved to have seen. If it would have been cool, if this one happened, that one happened. Let's talk about this. Anyway, YouTubers and Sydney Files, thanks for listening to me, and I will see you next time.